She could feel their eyes before she heard their laughter. The sun was hot on her veil, her boots scuffing awkwardly across the dust-packed aisle between the chapel benches. Her white dress dragged slightly on one side, because she was limping. Because she was 7 months pregnant. Because there was no groom waiting at the altar. Just a folded paper where his hat should have been. Her hand shook around the bouquet she'd woven herself. Every step echoed louder than the last. She didn't look left or right. She already knew what she'd see. Tight-lipped women shaking their heads, men murmuring to each other, a child pointing. "A bride like that?" someone hissed. "What kind of man would even want her now?" She kept walking. The aisle felt longer than it had yesterday during rehearsal, or maybe it just felt heavier. Her back ached, her ankles throbbed, but she didn't stop. Not when someone chuckled. Not when her father lowered his eyes from the front row, and not even when the preacher took one step back, as if unsure whether to speak the vows or just close his book. The baby shifted inside her belly, as if bracing too. She almost turned around. Almost. But then, just as she reached the empty altar, a shape stood from the back pew. Tall. Still. Wearing bone-beaded buckskin, braids streaked with silver, and eyes that didn't flinch. The Lakota chief walked forward without a word, every step like thunder in a silent room. He didn't bow. He didn't ask permission. He reached for her trembling hand, and with the lightest touch, kissed it. Not with lust, not with pity, but with the reverence reserved for warriors. Gasps broke across the chapel like gunfire. She blinked, lips parting, but he had already stepped back, giving her the floor. Suddenly, the laughter stopped. Because no one knew how to laugh when a man like that showed respect, they hadn't. Her hand remained in the air, still tingling where his lips had touched it. And for the first time in weeks, she remembered how it felt to be seen, not as ruined, but as sacred. She turned to face the crowd. The silence was hers now. She didn't cry. Not then, not even when her eyes found the chair meant for him. It was still there, second row from the front, with the ribbon she'd tied herself. The preacher hadn't removed it. No one had dared. But the man who'd promised to marry her hadn't just abandoned the church. He'd abandoned the town. Slipped away before dawn, leaving only a bottle and a folded note. "Can't do this. I ain't that strong." She hadn't read it more than once. She didn't need to. She already knew the kind of strength it took to love her in front of others, and that he never had it. But as she stood there at the altar, stomach swollen with the child they'd made on a cold November night, the baby kicked. Hard. Alive, almost defiant, like it had heard the silence and didn't agree with it. Her breath hitched. It wasn't pain, it was clarity. That heartbeat inside her ribs didn't need a husband to be born. It needed her spine, her voice, her refusal to shrink. She handed the bouquet to no one, laid it on the bench beside her. And when she turned back to the crowd, they weren't laughing anymore. Not because they'd changed, but because he had changed the room. The Lakota chief had returned to the back pew, arms folded, unreadable, but his presence hung over every whisper like a warning. Watch your tongues. She didn't know his name yet, only stories. That he'd once brokered peace with ranchers who feared him. That he rarely spoke, but when he did, it was law. That he'd buried his wife with his own hands and never remarried. And now, for some reason unknown to them all, he had kissed the hand of the town's most unwanted bride. The women began shifting in their seats. One even stood, looking unsure if she should approach. But the chief raised one brow, and she sat down again. That's when the preacher cleared his throat and opened the book. "Shall we continue?" he asked. Her voice was steady. No vows today." "Then, what do you want, child?" She looked toward the back, where the chief sat, then back to the altar. "I want them to remember this moment. I came anyway." After the ceremony that wasn't, they all spilled out into the sun. Slow, uncertain, like people leaving a fire they didn't expect to survive. She stood alone by the chapel doors, veil off, her cheeks hot, not from shame, but from the weight of holding it all together. The baker's wife passed her without speaking. The blacksmith gave her a nod, then turned quickly away. Even the midwife, who'd once promised to be there when her time came, crossed to the other side of the path, muttering about not inviting sin into her clean apron. But Nora, because her name was Nora and names matter, stood tall anyway. Her hands rested low over her belly, the baby shifting under her fingers like a reminder that someone still believed in her, even if it hadn't yet taken its first breath. The crowd thinned, the whispers faded, and just as she turned to walk the long mile home, boots worn thin, back aching from the child that would not wait, she heard it. Hooves, not a gallop, a walk, slow, intentional. She looked up. The Lakota chief had come forward on horseback, a quiet tan mare trailing behind him, saddled and bridled, reins loose. He said nothing, just dismounted, gave her a single nod, and offered the second horse's lead. "For me?" she asked, voice barely above a rasp. He tilted his head. "For the child," he said. "You shouldn't walk this far alone." Her throat tightened. "I don't have money for horses." He didn't blink. "Then pay with something better. Keep going." And just like that, he mounted again and rode off, dust curling behind him like a wordless blessing. She stared after him, one hand on the mare's neck, the other still curled at her belly. The horse was calm, patient, as if it had waited its whole life to carry someone like her. She climbed into the saddle slowly, breath catching from the sudden height. The town watched from behind curtains and corners, but no one said a word now. Because the girl they'd once called fool had been honored twice in one day by a man who bowed to no one. And as the horse turned toward home, she felt her spine straighten, not from pride, but from the quiet power of being lifted, not pitied. The wind was gentler down by the river, far from the chapel, far from eyes that judged or measured or whispered. She knelt in the shallows, bare feet cold in the current, scrubbing the hem of her wedding dress clean of dust it never should have touched. The white fabric had always been borrowed, a neighbor's gift. And yet now stained and torn, it felt more like hers than ever, because she'd walked in it. Limped, bled, stood tall. No one had carried her. No one had draped her in dignity. She had stitched it back herself, each thread a refusal to be erased. The water turned cloudy as she worked, red from a nicked knuckle, brown from the road. She didn't cry, not even when the breeze caught the drying veil and dragged it into the river. She let it float downstream. Some things weren't worth chasing. That night, her house creaked with quiet. She lit one candle, sat by the window, and wrote the name Elan on a scrap of cloth, a name she hadn't dared speak aloud for the child. It meant friendly, she'd learned, or sometimes strong. She folded the cloth and tucked it beneath her pillow. Morning came with bird song and a knock, not at the door. At the edge of the porch, where a bundle lay wrapped in leather, wildflowers, fresh picked, bound with sinew, a single hawk feather tucked in the center. She stepped outside barefoot, heart thudding. There was no note, just the scent of earth and pollen and something older. She knew who had left them. He always came and went like a shadow, but his gestures left marks deeper than any sermon. She pressed the bundle to her chest, warmth flooding through her for the first time in weeks. It wasn't love, not yet. It wasn't rescue either. It was recognition. She returned inside and placed the flowers in the chipped teacup that used to hold pennies for bread. The baby kicked again. She whispered to her belly, "You're not just a consequence. You're the reason I still stand." Outside, wind moved through the trees like breath. The townsfolk would talk again soon, but now they'd have to mention the chief, too. And she'd make sure they said his name with the same respect he gave her, without needing a single word. The first splatter came at dusk, a sharp thud against the windowpane, followed by snickering. Nora didn't flinch. She just folded her hands tighter around her teacup and waited. Another thud. Louder. This time, a smear of wet brown dripped down the glass. Outside, a boy no older than 10 darted away, his laughter thin and cruel. Nora stood slowly. She didn't rush, didn't shout. Just stepped outside and looked at the mess with eyes that had seen worse. Much worse. The boy was already gone, but the mud remained. She filled a bucket from the pump, wrung out a cloth, and began wiping the glass clean. Slow, methodical, like it was just another chore. She didn't cry, didn't curse, just worked until the glass gleamed again, because she'd lived through deeper stains. That night, as the stars pressed soft against the roof, she heard a second knock. This one gentler. Not a stone. A fist. She opened the door to find Mrs. Greeley, the boy's mother, standing with her shawl clutched tight, face pale. "I'm sorry," the woman blurted. "I didn't raise him to be cruel." Nora studied her a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "No tea, but there's bread." Mrs. Greeley hesitated, then entered, hands trembling. "He said you were a sinner," she whispered. "That you walked the aisle alone because you'd shamed the church." Nora folded her arms. "And what do you believe?" The woman swallowed hard. "I believe that any man who walks away from his child ain't a man, and that you walked farther than any of us ever would have dared." The silence between them wasn't cold. It was clearing. Mrs. Greeley set down a small bundle, clean linens and 2 jars of jam. "For the baby," she murmured. Nora nodded. "No thanks needed, just understanding." And when the woman left, the porch felt softer somehow, like the mud had never been there. The next morning the boy returned, not to throw but to scrape the dried dirt from the siding with his pocket knife. She watched from inside, said nothing, forgave him anyway, because shame doesn't pass from mother to child. But dignity can, and someone had to start the change. Why not her? The name followed her like dust. The limping bride. Children whispered it at the well. Teenagers giggled when she walked past the mercantile. Even grown women said it behind cupped hands, the kind that smile to your face while twisting a knife behind your back. Nora never corrected them. She didn't limp out of weakness. She limped because she'd fallen once in the snow during her 4th month, trying to carry firewood up a slope too steep for her boots. No one had helped. Not then. Not until the chief. He never called her names, never asked what had happened, never mentioned her foot. He just kept appearing, once outside the tannery, handing her a pouch of buffalo tallow for her aching joints. Another time on the trail, when she was carrying too many supplies, and he simply took half without asking, walking beside her until they reached her door. That day she finally spoke first. "Why do you help me?" He didn't stop walking. "Because you don't ask anyone to." That's not an answer. "No," he said, with a ghost of a smile. "It's a reason." From that day forward, he didn't just watch from a distance. He walked beside her. Never daily, never predictably, but always when she most needed it, like the sky knew and whispered it to him. And when the crowd still murmured, still pointed, she didn't flinch. Because beside her rode a man who had once stood before governors and refused their terms, who had buried brothers in wars and still chose peace, whose silence carried more weight than their noise ever could. One afternoon, they passed two women at the fence line who paused their gossip when they saw him. He looked at them once, just once, and they dropped their eyes like guilty children. Nora didn't smile. She didn't have to. She just adjusted the basket on her hip and kept walking, her limp steady but unashamed. She'd stopped trying to hide it. If they needed a name, let them have it. But she'd give it new meaning. Because sometimes the strongest steps are the ones taken after a man leaves you, and the most sacred when someone stays, not with words, but with presence. It began with a sharp cramp just after sunrise. Nora had been gathering firewood, stubborn as ever despite her swelling ankles and a belly that pressed hard against her ribs. She thought it was nothing, just another false alarm like the week before. But when she stood, the pain dropped her to her knees. This time it didn't pass. She was alone. Of course she was. The midwife had long stopped visiting. No friends to check in, just her and the baby, and the ache building in waves strong enough to take her breath. She crawled inside, dragging herself to the cot. Her water broke an hour later. No time for boiling cloths, no hands to hold, just her own strength and the echo of every whispered insult that said she couldn't do this without a man. She clenched her teeth and pushed, and cried, and pushed again. Until the door creaked open, she didn't lift her head, couldn't. Not until she heard the sound of moccasins on wood, gentle, certain. She looked up through sweat-stung eyes and saw him, the chief. He didn't speak, just knelt beside her, his weathered hands already unwrapping a satchel lined with clean cloth, herbs, water. "I sent for someone," he said quietly, "but I'll stay until she comes." "You don't have to." "I know." He tucked a damp cloth beneath her neck, moved her hair from her face. "You are not alone, Nora." No one had spoken her name with such care since her mother passed. Another contraction tore through her, and she screamed, but not from fear. Not now, because someone was beside her who wouldn't flinch. He held her hand when she thought she'd break it. He whispered in Lakota between breaths, words she didn't understand but felt in her bones. Safe, sacred, strong. The midwife arrived too late. By the time she stepped through the door, the chief was already wrapping the baby in deer hide, eyes misted but steady. A daughter, whole, crying strong, alive. Nora sobbed, not from pain, but from awe. "Thank you," she whispered. "You were brave," he said. "I just bore witness." And for the first time, she believed she hadn't done it alone, not from pity, but from honor. By morning, the whispers had returned. This time about the child. Some said the baby had no father. Others said she did, but he ran because he knew what she was. They called Nora names again, but softer now, because the chief still walked those roads, still watched with eyes that didn't miss a thing. When Nora asked the preacher if she could bury the placenta beside the church, beneath the same soil where her mother lay, he tightened his jaw. "That ground is for the sanctified," he said. "She wasn't wed." Nora didn't argue. She just nodded and walked away, holding the small bundle in her arms like it was still part of her body. She didn't cry until she reached the trail behind her house, and found him waiting. The chief was crouched in the grass, a knife in one hand, a ring of stones arranged in the earth. She blinked, stunned. "You knew?" "I watched them deny you. Again." His voice held no pity, just gravity. No child enters this world unblessed, and no mother should carry grief when she's just given life. She knelt beside him. I don't know your customs. Then we make new ones. He offered the blade. She held it with shaking hands, carved a single symbol in the center of the circle, a sun, his people's sign for beginnings. Together they lowered the bundle into the earth. No prayers, just breathe, just meaning. The wind shifted, and with it, something inside her loosened. Not shame, not guilt, just space. Space for love that didn't ask permission. When they stood, he pressed a stone into her palm, a red one, warm from his pocket. Place this by your door, he said. Those who know will never cross it without respect. And those who don't? He looked toward the town. They'll learn. That night, the baby slept easier than ever before. Nora traced the chief's symbol into the wood above her daughter's crib, a silent promise etched into pine. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But she knew this. No matter who laughed, who judged, or who left, she had buried shame in the earth, and something stronger had grown in its place. It began with small things. Her baby didn't cry during storms, slept through nights no child ever should. When Nora sang the lullabies her mother taught her, birds perched on the windowsill like they understood. A mare in the neighbor's barn, long thought barren, foaled 2 days after Nora touched its belly and whispered soft words. Rumors took root like weeds. They called it witchery, that the chief had cast a charm, that her limp was the mark of some forest spirit. One child said she saw fireflies follow Nora even in the day. The blacksmith's wife claimed the bread Nora baked stayed fresh too long to be natural, but no one stopped coming. They came quietly, in the evenings, a boy with a fever, a woman with a sleeping sickness, a young man who stuttered so hard he hadn't spoken in weeks. Nora never claimed magic. She just listened. She just touched. She just remembered what it felt like to be treated like a wound instead of a person. And so she poured warmth into everything she gave. Tea, cloth, quiet. The chief never spoke of it. But he came more often now. Sometimes he sat with her daughter in his lap, whispering words in Lakota. Sometimes he stood behind her as she read aloud, a shadow that never made her feel small. One night, as she rocked her baby beneath a silver moon, she asked him, "Do you believe they're right?" He didn't blink. Number magic is only what people don't understand. Then what is this? She whispered. Why do people keep changing when they come near? He looked at her, at the scar on her ankle, the strength in her back, the softness in her voice. Because you stayed when others ran, because you bled and still chose to offer your hands instead of your fists, because grace feels like witchery to those who've never known it. And she knew then this wasn't about spells or legends. This was about light, and what happens when one woman refuses to let her light die, even when the world tells her it should have been snuffed out long ago. Tomorrow, they'd whisper again. But tonight, they'd sleep easier because of her. Spring came early that year, painting the valley in wildflowers and warming the porch where she now rocked her child. The townsfolk had quieted, not because they'd all changed, but because she had. She no longer looked down when they passed. She didn't wait for their approval. She had built her life from scorched ground, and that kind of strength can't be ignored. One Sunday morning, the chapel bell rang again. It wasn't for a sermon. It was for a gathering, called by the chief himself. No one had heard of such a thing in years. They came, curious, cautious, and there he stood, beside the pulpit he never used, in the full regalia of his people. Beaded vest, turquoise stones, 2 feathers braided behind his left ear. Nora arrived last, holding her daughter on her hip. She didn't know why she came, only that her feet carried her there before her mind caught up. He didn't ask her to speak, didn't ask her to stand beside him. He simply stepped down, crossed the aisle slowly, and knelt. Not before the crowd, before her. He took her hand, kissed it again, the way he had on the day they laughed at her, and pressed something into her palm. A woven band of sweetgrass, a Lakota sign of union, of respect, of chosen family. No words, no ceremony, just that gesture, in front of everyone. A silence thicker than thunder fell over the crowd. She didn't cry. She just reached for his hand and held it tight. The child between them cooed, soft as wind, and the people finally understood. This was not pity. This was not rescue. This was love born of witnessing, built from shared strength, sealed without pageantry. Later that night, when the porch was quiet and the moon full, she whispered to the sleeping baby in her arms, "One day they'll ask how I survived." The baby shifted, breath slow and deep. "And I'll tell them," she continued, "that I didn't survive. I rebuilt." And somewhere on the wind, in the rustle of cottonwood trees and the breath of the plains, she felt his presence not behind her, but beside her, and knew she'd never be laughed at again. And if this story reminded you that dignity isn't given by the crowd, but earned, step by step, by those who never stop walking, then subscribe to Echoes of the West. And tell us in the comments, have you ever stood alone until someone's quiet respect changed everything?